Welcome to the Genius Talk podcast. I am your host Atul Raj from the bestemailmarketer.com, and today we have Kieron James with us. Kieron, thank you so much for joining.
Hi, Atul. Nice to be with you.
Okay, brother. So for our listeners who don't know you, can you tell them who you are and what do you do?
Yeah, sure. So I've been involved in tech businesses now for best part of 30 years. Started out very late in these 98 doing domain name registration, online company formations. Over the years, been involved in a number of things from those to email marketing, telecommunications, and then most recently into online payments. Well, not online and offline, all kinds of payments.
Okay, so what's the story behind starting Wonderful?
Wonderful. It is kind of an interesting way we got started. I was running the telecoms business back in 2016, and my son decided he was going to do a parachute jump for charity. And he got really frustrated after finishing his jump by the amount of money that didn't make it to the charity all his friends had donated online. And there were various deductions from those donations, so the charity didn't receive all of the payment. So we were really keen, sensing his frustration with that. We thought, well, can we set up an alternative where the charities get 100% of the donation and fund it through corporate sponsorship? Basically, that was the model. So that's how we got started, nearly 10 years ago now. And originally processing all the donations using credit cards and debit cards through one of the big providers of that service. And that really became, in many ways, the Achilles heel for that operation, because as the project grew and more charities came on board, we just found that we were going to the corporate sponsors every month asking for more money, and pretty much all of that money went to pay credit and debit card processing fees. It was like 90+% of the operational costs were in just getting money from a donor's account to a charity's account. So we looked around for some solutions. That sort of search for alternatives coincided with COVID. So we briefly paused the platform whilst we had a look and discovered open banking. And that's really how everything changed, because that whole process of making a donation using open banking was so simple, fast and secure that we kind of stood back and thought this is a solution that not only benefits charities and fundraisers and donors, but clearly it's of huge benefit to anyone who's receiving payments. If you're processing payments as a small business that you're receiving via debit and credit card, it's a much cheaper alternative and more secure. So that's how we got started. We started in that charity sector with that philanthropic project. I think switched to open banking start of COVID and thought, here's a business opportunity, and incorporated a new business called Wonderful Payments. The online platform was at wonderful.org, so it seemed like a good name for the payments business. We got ourselves authorized by the Financial Conduct Authority, which took best part of a year, and then started building services for small businesses.
Okay, so you have founded and exited multiple telecom and communication businesses before Wonderful. So what were the key turning points that shaped you as a founder?
The key turning points, or
Yep.
I think in terms of setting up the businesses, it's always been around spotting opportunities. And usually that's been a result of some technological change. Either that, or occasionally it's been a regulatory change. So some of the ideas that we came up with when we were operating the telecoms business were around changes to telephone numbering in the UK and the introduction of new number ranges, which were billed differently. O3 numbers came along in the middle of us running that telecoms business, and that presented a great opportunity to introduce a new free telephone conferencing service, much cheaper for users to dial an O3 number, certainly from a mobile, than it was to dial an O8 number in the UK. So, that regulatory change spurred some innovation there in that business. I think a lot of the time we're looking for solutions that we can deliver that save small businesses time, because if you're running a fairly small business, then that seems to be something that you're often very short of. So if it's a solution that's easy to use, easy to find, easy to register, that seems to create quite a good opportunity in the market. And we did that with all of the businesses I mentioned. So company formations back in 1998, if you were forming a limited company, that was a very kind of manual process, very paper-based. And the internet seemed like a great place back in those early days to create a process to do that online. So that's what we did. Similarly with domain name registration. And a lot of the businesses, it's just been targeting those small businesses and then trying to find something that saves them time and money.
Okay, so for a non-technical business owner, like how do you explain what open banking payments are and why they matters?
Sure, no problem at all. Yeah, so the way open banking works, it's kind of the first real change that we've seen in payments. You think debit and credit cards have been around for, or credit cards probably 60 years now in the UK, as long as I've been around in the UK. So yeah, a pretty long history, and everyone's very familiar with that technology, and it's relatively easy to use. But some of the drawbacks are around the fact that it wasn't really designed for the use that it's been predominantly, used for now. So things like online e-commerce. Clearly, credit cards predated that, so did debit cards. So you've seen introductions in terms of the way that those transactions are secure, which are really to suit that, these newer technologies, new applications. So we saw things like on credit cards, the introduction of CVVs on the back of the card to accompany the signature. We've seen things like one-time passwords being introduced if you're making an online purchase or a purchase where you want some additional security layers. We've seen CVVs become dynamic CVVs. We've seen then disposable credit card numbers, and all of these are layers on top of a system that was developed and predates the technologies that we're all using today. Open banking doesn't. Open banking's kind of built natively in that environment. So by definition, things like strong customer authentication, which is the reason you're asked for those one-time passwords and all of that kind of is verifying that you've got that card and you own that card. All of that's built into an open banking transaction. So typically what you will do in terms of the flow, you might see a pay by bank link on an e-commerce website that sits above PayPal, or it sits above your credit card, or maybe it's further down the page. When you click that link, if you're on a laptop or a desktop computer, what you'll see then typically is something like potentially a QR code. You scan that QR code, and what's happening then is you're being taken directly into your mobile banking app via your mobile phone, a place where everyone's very familiar and feels very secure, and all of those checks and balances are taking place. So things like biometric access to that app. And then you're just simply tapping to confirm that payment. And on the screen in your mobile banking app, you'll see who the recipient of the money is. You'll see the exact amount that you're going to pay, and you're just authorizing it directly from your bank account. So in terms of benefits for the business owner, that money then hits their account practically in real time. So it's usually a couple of seconds and you're getting paid rather than waiting for settlement, a day, 2 days, sometimes even longer. In the charity sector, from some of the big platforms, you can wait more than a month to get that settled down. So that instant settlement is really important. But from the consumer's point of view, it's the fact that you've got that strong customer authentication built into the product. You know who you're paying. You can see that on the screen. You're in your mobile banking environment, and you're just confirming a payment. So really, really straightforward.
Yeah, by the way, I'm curious, like how are you growing wonderful?
How are we growing it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Again, going back those 30 years to a lot of my background in this, one of the early businesses I operated was also web design. So we were building websites, and I obviously got very into search engine optimization way back when, actually, probably when it was a lot easier than it is these days. So, a lot of it's organic. Wonderful.org, the online fundraising platform, is actually a really good vehicle for getting this new technology in front of people. The reason that we like it is that, if I ask you, for example, to donate £10 or donate whatever you could afford to my charity run, say I was doing the London Marathon, then you'll feel, I guess, some compulsion to do that because you're a friend, you want to make that donation. Wonderful.org, you can only make that donation now using open banking. So you can't just decide, oh, I'm going to make a debit card or a credit card transaction. So we're kind of almost locking you into that process. Now, the reality is, if you've never done it before, you might go, this is a bit scary. I've not seen this before. Once you've made your first payment, you'll see 90% of people go back and make a second because it is just so much easier. So from our point of view, wonderful.org has actually been, not through design, but it's been really helpful in terms of putting this new payment process in front of lots of people who might otherwise not have tried it. They might otherwise have just gone, do you know what, I'll use PayPal or I'll use a debit card and make this payment. So wonderful.org's been a good way of getting in front of people. Search engine optimization, we work really hard on. And then organic, I guess, word of mouth. We've got a lot of small businesses. By definition, you'll probably take on more small business clients than you would if you were taking on, corporate clients. So it might be 100 small businesses as opposed to one enterprise type customer that you'll bring on. So again, that kind of, that spreads the word even more because there are so many more users then.
Okay, so what are the biggest misconceptions businesses still have about open banking compared to card and traditional payment process?
I think the biggest, and it's a shame really, is some of the
Mhm.
naming. So open banking is really describing the open APIs and the fact that that is what really accelerated innovation. So let me explain that. A few years ago, the major banks in the UK were asked to open up their systems to allow regulated entities like us, fintechs. We're regulated by the FCA. We're authorized by them to do what we're doing, and that's a fairly big piece in terms of the process to do that. But by opening up their APIs, we're then able to process those payments on your behalf. So that I think has been a really big stimulus to growth is mandating that innovation in the early days, and making that happen. Sorry, I've lost track of the question you asked me then, just in terms of what was the specific question?
Okay, what are the biggest misconception businesses
Oh,
still
there you
have?
go. Yeah. So that's where I was getting to. So open banking is describing the openness of the APIs. It's that technological opening up of the bank's APIs to allow fintechs to do it. But as a name for the product and service, it can sometimes be a bit confusing and perhaps even a little bit alarming to associate the word open with banking because everyone wants their bank to be nicely secure and tight rather than this concept of
Open, yeah.
openness and sharing and so on. So I think sometimes, we've encountered that people just any new technology can be a bit scary. Any new technology when it's to do with your bank account and your finances and making payments becomes that much scarier. So, that education piece is quite a big one for us to inform about all of those things I mentioned, like strong customer authentication being inherent and that being a critical part of that whole flow. But that, we're seeing that really happening now. The transaction volumes are increasing. I mean, we're actually transacting now much more for charities than we did when we were using credit card and debit cards. So by volume and value, we're doing more through open banking than we did when we were using cards that have been around, as I say, 60 years and everyone's very familiar with. So I think that adoption's happening pretty quickly.
Okay, so where do you want Wonderful to be in next 5 years?
We see continued growth in open banking. We see not only the growth in the payments, but I think one of the things you have with open banking, we also have something called AIS permissions. That's account information services. Now, that allows us to do some very clever things. Again, with the explicit consent of the user, we can look at transactions, we can look at balances, we can look at all sorts of things, which can be immensely helpful in so many different areas, whether that's looking at affordability. So think about that charity donation. What charities really like you to do is set up a recurring donation. So you go onto a website and say, I'm going to give £15, and they've got, why don't you give us £5 every month? What AIS would allow us to do is actually look at the affordability in real time. And with some of the emerging technologies now that we're seeing in open banking, so something called commercial variable recurring payments. What a terrible mouthful, but that's almost like a replacement to direct debit and card on file. So again, combine those two things and you could look very specifically at charity and go, do you know what? Actually, this month money's a little bit tight. Rather than make that £5 donation, why don't you reduce it to two? Or maybe you're feeling very flush and you want to give £10 this month. So that direct debit replacement, that variable recurring payment through open banking could be linked directly to what's happening in the real world in terms of your personal finances. But there are so many other areas, I think open banking lends itself to things like ID verification as well. The banks have already verified you in order to open your account. So if we can use that access to the account through you again giving some consent, then that's a really important part in ID verification too, because we can say, yes, we know this person's uploaded a passport, we know they've given you a driving license, and we know that on this day they also, with their consent, opened the bank account and said, I'm the owner of this bank account.
Mhm.
And then you've got all of the, the bank account checks in the background of the ID check that will have taken place. So, all of that AML, KYC type stuff if you're in a business.
Yeah. Okay, so looking back when you started, what's one lesson you will tell yourself as a founder if you could restart today?
I think always try to be realistic about the numbers. So what I mean by that is that there've been times when you can get very enthusiastic about a particular product or service and think there's a market for it because it's something that you really love. So that passion overtakes the reality of, is there genuinely a market for this thing that I'm trying to launch, or this new product, or whatever it might be? And I've been guilty of that in the past with a couple of products that we've tried to launch over the years, and just thought, actually, just because I really love this thing doesn't mean everyone else does. So I think doing that market research initially is critical, of course, and writing your business plan. But also, even once you're launched, it's being really objective and really hard and fast about the numbers. If the numbers are indicating that this isn't working, don't just continue until until you absolutely can't continue. It might be better to take a decision a little bit earlier, pivot, even exit. Don't be afraid to just stop and do something different.
Okay, so for our listeners who want to use Wonderful or want to connect with you, where can they go?
Domain names are really simple. Again, thanks to all that history in that space. So wonderful.co.uk, which I registered back in 1998. So yeah, nearly 30 years ago. And wonderful.org is the fundraising platform. And then you'll find me in all the usual places, LinkedIn. So yeah, they're probably the best. If you actually, interestingly as well, if I might just give it a quick mention, if you're in the enterprise space, we've launched an enterprise division for Wonderful quite recently as well, which you'll find on asima.co.uk, and that's ASIMA. So again, that's for enterprise open banking customers. Sorry.
Thank you, Kiran, for saying that. And thank you so much for spending some time with us. It was really fun chatting with you.
Thank you ever so much. It's been my pleasure.